so remain. But the other day, somebody insulted me in terms that were redolent of 1920s Soviet Russia. He said that I had no right to vote Leave because I was, in fact, a liberal cosmopolitan. And that rocked me at first. And I then decided, of course, that as insults go, I didn't mind it at all because it was probably true. And so I want this morning to explain why the campaign to leave the EU is attracting other liberal spirits. And people I admire, such as David Owen and Gisela Stewart, Nigel Lawson, John Longworth, people who love Europe, but who feel at home on the continent, but whose attitudes towards the project of European Union have been hardening over time. For many of us who are now deeply sceptical, the evolution has been roughly the same. We began decades ago to query the anti-democratic absurdities of the EU. Then we began to campaign for reform, and we were excited in 2013 by the Prime Minister's Bloomberg speech, and then quietly despaired as no reform was forthcoming. And then, thanks to the referendum given to this country by David Cameron, we find that a door has magically opened in our lives. We can see the sunlit meadows beyond. I believe we would be mad not to take this once-in-a-lifetime chance to walk through that door. Because the truth is, it is not we who have changed, it is the EU that has changed out of all recognition. And to keep insisting that the EU is about economics is like saying that the Italian mafia is interested in olive oil and real estate. It is true, but profoundly uninformative about the real aims of that organisation. What was once the EEC has undergone a spectacular metamorphosis in the last 30 years. And the crucial point is that it is still becoming ever more centralising, interfering, and anti-democratic. You only have to read the Lisbon Treaty, whose constitutional provisions were rejected by 3 EU populations, the French, the Dutch, and the Irish, to see how far this thing has moved on from what we signed up to in 1972. Brussels now has exclusive or explicit competence for trade, customs, competition, agriculture, fisheries, environment, consumer protection, transport, trans-European networks, energy, the areas of freedom, security, and justice, and new powers over culture, tourism, education, and youth. The EU already has considerable powers to set rates of indirect taxation across the whole 28-nation territory, and of course it is in total control of monetary policy for all 19 Eurozone countries. In recent years, Brussels has acquired its own foreign minister, its own series of EU embassies around the world, and is continuing to develop its own defence policy. We have got to stop trying to kid the British people. And we've got to stop saying one thing in Brussels and another to the domestic audience. And to end the systematic subterfuge to conceal from the public the scale of the constitutional changes involved. We need to look at the legal reality, which is that this is an accelerating effort to build a country called Europe. Look at that list of Lisbon competences, with 45 new fields of policy where Britain can be now outvoted by a qualified majority. And you can see why the House of Commons Library has repeatedly confirmed that when you add primary and secondary legislation together, the EU is now generating 60% of the laws passing through Parliament. The independence of this country is being seriously compromised. And it's this fundamental democratic problem, this erosion of democracy, that brings me into this fight. People are alarmed and surprised to discover that our gross contributions to the EU budget are now running at about £20 billion a year, and that the net contribution is £10 billion. And it is not just that we have no control over how that money is spent. No one has any proper control. which is why EU spending is persistently associated with fraud. Of course, the Remain campaign dismisses this UK contribution as a mere bagatelle, even though you could otherwise use it to pay for a new British hospital every week. But that expense is, in a sense, the least of the costs inflicted by the EU on this country. It is deeply corrosive of popular trust in democracy that every year UK politicians tell the public that they can cut immigration to the tens of thousands and then find that they miss their targets by hundreds of thousands, so that we add a population the size of Newcastle every year, with all the extra and unfunded pressure that puts on the NHS and other public services. In our desperation to meet our hopeless so-called targets, we push away brilliant students from Commonwealth countries who want to pay to come to our universities, and we find ourselves hard-pressed to recruit people who might work in the NHS as opposed to make use of its services, because we have absolutely no power to control the numbers who are coming with no job offers and no qualifications from the 28 EU countries. I'm in favour of immigration, but I'm also in favour of control and of politicians taking responsibility for what is happening. And I think it bewilders people to be told that this most basic power of the state to decide who has the right to live and work in your country has been taken away and now resides in Brussels. And as I say, that is only one aspect of a steady attrition of the rights of the people to decide their priorities and to remove at elections those who take the decisions. I think it's sad that our powers of economic self-government have become so straitened that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has to go around personally asking other finance ministers to allow him to cut VAT on tampons. And as far as I can see, we have still not secured consent. It is worrying that the European Court of Justice, that's Luxembourg, not Strasbourg, should now be freely adjudicating on human rights questions, and whether or not this country has the right to deport people the Home Office believes are a threat to our security. And it is peculiar that the government is now straining at the gnat of the Convention and the Strasbourg Court, whose rulings are actually not binding on UK courts, while swallowing the camel of the 55-article Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is fully justiciable by the European Court in Luxembourg, when you consider that it is the rulings of that court in Luxembourg that are binding and must be applied by every court in this country, including Parliament. It is absurd that Britain, historically a great free trading nation, has been unable for 42 years to do a free trade deal with Australia, New Zealand, China, India, and America. It is, above all, bizarre for the Remain campaign to say that after the UK agreement of February, we are now living in a reformed, quote-unquote, EU, when there has been not a single change to EU competencies, not a single change to the treaty, nothing on agriculture, nothing on the role of the court, nothing of any substance on borders, nothing remotely resembling the agenda for change that was promised in the 2013 Bloomberg speech. And in that excellent speech, the Prime Minister savaged the EU's lack of competitiveness, its remoteness from the voters, its relentless movement in the wrong direction. And he said, the biggest danger, I'm quoting from the Bloomberg speech, the biggest danger to the European Union comes not from those who advocate change, but from those who denounce new thinking as heresy. In its long history, Europe has experience of heretics who turned out to have a point. More of the same will not see the European Union keeping pace with the new powerhouse economies. More of the same will not bring the European Union ever any closer to its citizens. More of the same will just produce more of the same. Less competitiveness, less growth, and fewer jobs. And that will make our countries weaker, not stronger, and that is why we need fundamental, far-reaching change. I'm still quoting the Bloomberg speech, by the way, and he was right then. He was absolutely right then. We were told then that there had to be fundamental reform and full-on treaty change that would happen before the referendum, or else the government was willing to campaign to leave if they didn't get the changes that they wanted. And that, frankly, is what the Prime Minister and the government should be doing now. If you look at what we were promised and what we got, the government should logically be campaigning on the Leave side today. We were told many times by the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Chancellor, that we were going to get real changes to the law on free movement, so that you needed to have a job lined up before you could come here. We have got no such change. We were told that we would get a working opt-out from the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, which, by the way, gives the European Court the power to determine the application of the 1951 Convention on Refugees and Asylum, as well as extradition, child protection, and victims' rights. We got nothing. We were told that we would be able to stop the Eurozone countries from using EU institutions to create a fiscal and political union. We got nothing. Instead, we gave up our veto. The Five Presidents' report makes it clear that as soon as the UK referendum is out of the way, they will proceed with new structures of political and fiscal integration that this country should have no part in, but which will inevitably involve us, just as we were forced, in spite of promises to the contrary, to take part in the bailout of Greece. They want to go ahead with new rules on company law and property rights and every aspect of employment law and even taxation. And we will be dragged in. To call this a reformed EU is an offence against the Trade Description Act, or rather the EU Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that, of course, replaced the Trade Description Act in 2008. The EU system is a ratchet hauling us ever further into a federal structure. We have proved to ourselves time and again that we cannot change the direction, we cannot change the pace, we cannot interrupt the steady erosion of democracy, and given that we do not accept the destination, it is time to tell our friends and partners in a spirit of the utmost cordiality that we wish to forge a new relationship based on free trade and intergovernmental cooperation. We need to vote leave on June the 23rd, and in the meantime, we must deal with three big myths that are peddled by the Remain campaign. The first is the so-called economic argument. The Remainers accept that there is a loss of political independence, but they claim that this trade-off is economically beneficial. The second argument we might broadly call the peace in Europe argument. We've heard a bit of it this morning, that the EU is associated with 70 years of stability, and we need to stay in to prevent, in shorthand, German tanks crossing the French border. The third argument is more abstract, but potent with some people, and I mentioned it already, is you can't really want to leave the EU without being in some way anti-European, and therefore that the Remain campaign have a monopoly, as I say, on liberal cosmopolitanism. All three arguments are wholly bogus. The most important mistake is to think that there is some effective and sensible trade-off between the loss of democratic control and greater prosperity. The whole thrust of the Remain argument is that there is a, yes, they accept there's a democratic cost, but an economic benefit. That if we accept that 60% of our laws are made in Brussels, we will see some great boost in our trade and our exports and in the overall economic performance of the EU. This is turning out to be simply false. The loss of democratic control is spiritually damaging and socially risky, and the economic benefits of remaining subject to the single market lawmaking machine, as opposed to access to the single market, are in fact very hard to detect. What the government wants is for us to remain locked into the single market lawmaking regime and to be exposed to 2,500 new EU regulations a year. What we want is for Britain to be like many other countries in having free trade access to the territory currently covered by the single market, but not to be subject to the vast, growing and politically driven empire of EU law. And there is very good evidence that this is the most sensible position to be in. take the two relevant 20-year periods, before and after the creation of the single market. In other words, from 1973 to 1992, and then from 1992 to 2012. Now, when the single market dawned, I know I was there, we were told that it was going to be a great dynamo of job and wealth creation. 800 billion euros, the Cecchini report said, extra European GDP. We were told that it was going to send exports whizzing ever faster across borders. So what happened? Did Britain export more to the rest of the EEC 11, the other 11, as a result of the single market? On the contrary, the rate of growth slowed, as Michael Burridge has shown this year. British exports of goods were actually 22% lower at the end of the second 20-year period than if they had continued to grow at the rate of the 20 years before 1992 and the dawn of the single market. Now, before you say this might just be a result of Britain's sluggish performance in the export of manufactured goods, the same failure was seen in the case of the 12 EEC countries themselves. We were told that goods would start pinging around the EEC as if in some supercharged cyclotron, and on the contrary, the rate of growth flattened again, 14.6% lower than in the previous 20 years when there was no single market. So what was the decisive advantage to Britain or any other country of being inside this system and accepting these thousands of one-size-fits-all regulations? In fact, you could argue that many countries were better off outside and not subject to the bureaucracy. In the period of existence of this vaunted single market from 1992 to 2011, there were 27 non-EU countries whose exports of goods to the rest of the EU grew faster than the UK's. And most embarrassingly of all, there were 21 countries who did better than the UK in exporting services to the other 11. So where was this great European relaunch that was supposed to be driven by the single market? In the 20 years since the start of the single market, the rate of growth in the EU countries has actually been outstripped by the non-EU countries of the OECD. It's actually the independent countries that have done better, and the EU has been a microclimate of scandalously high unemployment. This year, the United States is projected to grow by 2.4%, China by 6.5%, New Zealand by 2%, Australia by 2.5%, India by 7.5%, the Eurozone by 1.5%. All that extra growth that we were promised, all those extra jobs, the claims made for the single market look increasingly fraudulent. It has not boosted the rate of British exports to the EU. It has not even boosted growth in exports between the EU 12. And it has not stopped a generation of young people in a huge belt of Mediterranean countries from being thrown on the economic scrap heap. What was that corpus of EU regulation, and what has it done to drive innovation? There are more patents now from outside the EU being registered at the EU Patent Office than from within the EU itself. The Eurozone has no universities within the top 20 and has been woefully left behind by America in the tech revolution, in spite of all those directives I seem to remember in the 1990s about les réseaux télématiques, or possibly, of course, it's been left behind because of those directives that I remember. There are plenty of other parts of the world where the free market and competition has been driving down the cost of mobile roaming charges and cut-price airline tickets without the need for a vast supranational bureaucracy enforced by a supranational court. Never forget, whatever piece of EU legislation is promulgated immediately becomes justiciable by that court. I hear again the arguments of the City of London and the anxieties that have been expressed. We heard them 15 years ago, when many of the same Remainers prophesied disaster for the City of London if we failed to join the euro. They said that all the banks would flee to Frankfurt. Well, Canary Wharf alone is now bigger than the entire Frankfurt financial centre, and Canary Wharf has kept growing relentlessly since the crash of 2008. As for the argument that we need the muscle of EU membership. We, poor Britain, needs the muscle of EU membership if we are to do trade deals. Well, look, as I say, at the results after 42 years of membership. The EU has done trade deals with the Palestinian Authority and with San Marino and others. Bravo. But it has failed to conclude agreements with India, China, or, as I say, even America. Why? Because negotiating on behalf of the EU is like trying to ride a vast 28-man pantomime horse with everybody pulling in different directions. For decades, deals with America have been blocked by the French film industry, and the current TTIP negotiations are stalled at least partly because the Greek feta cheese manufacturers object to the concept of American feta cheese. And they may be aesthetically right or wrong, but Greek feta cheese should not be holding up British trade agreements. Global trade is not carried on by kind permission of people like Peter Mandelson. People and businesses trade with each other and always will, as long as they have something to buy and sell. But it is notable that even when the EU has done a trade deal, it does not always seem to work in Britain's favour. In 10 out of the last 15 trade deals that the EU has concluded, British trade with our partners actually slowed down rather than speeded up after the beginning of the deal. Now, is that because of some defect in us or in the deal? Or could it be that the EU officials did not take account of the real interests of the UK economy, which is so different in structure from France and Germany? And might that be because the sole and entire responsibility for UK trade policy is in the hands of the EU Commission, a body where only 3.6% of the officials actually come from this country? In trying to compute the costs and benefits of belonging to the single market, we should surely add the vast opportunity cost of not being able to do free trade deals with the most lucrative and fastest growing markets in the world, because we are in the EU. When you consider that only 6% of UK businesses export to the EU 28, and when you consider that 100% of businesses, large and small, must comply with every jot and tittle of regulation, and when you consider that the costs of this regulation are £600 million a week to British business, I'm afraid you're drawn to the same conclusion as Wolfgang Munchauer, the economics commentator of the Financial Times, who said, whatever the reasons may be for remaining in the EU, they are not economic. And so I return to my point, which is that we must stop the pretense. This is about politics and a political project that is now getting out of control. To understand our predicament and the trap we are in, we need to go back to the immediate post-war period and the agony and shame of a broken continent. There were two brilliant Frenchmen, a wheeler-dealing civil servant with big American connections called Jean Monnet, and a French foreign minister called Robert Schuman. They wanted to use instruments of economic integration to make war between France and Germany not just a practical, but a psychological impossibility. And it was an exercise in what I believe used to be called behavioral therapy, inducing a change in underlying attitudes by forcing a change of behavior. Their inspired idea was to weave a cat's cradle of supranational legislation that would not only bind the former combatants together, but create a new sensation of Europeanness. As Schuman himself put it, Europe will be built through concrete achievements which create a de facto solidarity. Jean Monnet believed that people would become in mind European, and that this primarily regulatory and functional approach would produce a European identity and a European consciousness. Almost 60 years after the Treaty of Rome, I do not see many signs that this programme is working. The European elites have indeed created an ever denser federal system of government, but at a pace that far exceeds the emotional and psychological readiness of the British people. And the reasons are obvious. There is simply no common political culture in Europe, no common media, no common sense of humour or satire, and this is important, there is no awareness of each other's politics. So the European Union as a whole has no common sense of the two things you need for a democracy to work efficiently. You need trust and you need shame. There is no trust, partly for the obvious reason that people don't always understand each other's languages, and there is no shame because it's never clear who you are letting down when you abuse the EU system. And that's why there is such a cavalier waste and theft of EU funds, because it's everybody's money and therefore it's nobody's money. If you walk around London today, you will notice that the 12-star flag of the EU is flying all over the place, and that's because it's Schuman Day today. It is the birthday of the founder of this project, and the elites have decreed that it should be properly marked. And let me ask you today, do you feel any particular loyalty to that flag? Do your hearts pitter-patter as you watch it flutter from all sorts of public buildings, probably including City Hall? On the contrary, the British share with other EU populations a growing sense of alienation, which is one of the reasons why turnout at European elections continues to decline. As Jean-Claude Juncker has himself remarked with disapproval, too many Europeans are returning to a national or regional mindset. In the face of that disillusionment, the European elites are doing exactly the wrong thing. Instead of devolving power, they are centralizing. Instead of going with the grain of human nature and public opinion, they are reaching for the same corrective behavioral therapy as Monnet and Schuman. More legislation, more federal control, and whenever there is a crisis of any kind in Europe, the cry is always the same: more Europe. What did they do when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the French panicked about the inevitability of German unification? They decided to lock Germany in with a single currency: more Europe. And what are they saying now that the single currency has turned out to be a disaster? More Europe. They persist in the delusion that political cohesion can be created by a forcible economic integration, and they are achieving exactly the opposite. What is the distinctive experience of the people of Greece over the last 8 years? It is a complete humiliation, a sense of powerlessness. The suicide rate has risen by 35%, life expectancy has actually fallen, youth unemployment is around 50%. It is an utter disgrace to our continent. That is what happens when you destroy democracy. Do the Greeks feel any warmer towards the Germans? Do they feel a community of interest? Do they feel in heart and mind European? Of course not. In Austria, the far right have just won an election for the first time since the 1930s. The French National Front are on the march, and Marine Le Pen may very well do well in the presidential elections. You could not say that EU integration is promoting either mutual understanding or moderation, and the economic consequences range from nugatory to disastrous. The answer to the problems of Europe today is not more Europe, if that means more forcible economic and political integration. The answer is reform, and devolution of the reform of the kind the Prime Minister demanded in his Bloomberg speech, and devolution of powers back to nations and people, and a return to intergovernmentalism, at least for this country. And that means vote leave on June the 23rd. And of course, there will be some in this country who are rightly troubled by a sense of neighbourly duty. There are Remainers who may actually agree with much of the foregoing about the economic advantages that are either overstated or non-existent, or indeed negative. They may feel, however, uneasy about pulling out of the EU in its hour of need, when our neighbours are in distress, and at this point they deploy the so-called peace in Europe argument that if Britain leaves the EU there will be a return to slaughter on Flanders fields. I have to say, I think this grossly underestimates the way Europe has changed and the NATO guarantee that in reality has underpinned peace in Europe. I saw myself the disaster in the Balkans when the EU was charged and mandated with sorting out the former Yugoslavia, and I saw how actually it was NATO and the American-led alliance that had to come in and sort it out. And it, in my view, understates this argument, the sense in which it is now, I'm afraid, the EU itself and its anti-democratic tendencies that are now a force for instability and alienation. Europe faces twin crises of mass migration and a euro that has proved a disaster for some member states. And the grim truth is that the risks of staying in this unreformed EU are intensifying and not diminishing. In the next 6 weeks, we must all politely but relentlessly put the following questions to our friends in the Remain campaign. 1, how can you possibly control immigration into this country? 2, the living wage is an excellent policy, but how will you stop it being a big pull factor for uncontrolled EU immigration, given that it is far higher than the minimum wage in many other EU countries? 3, how will you prevent the European Court from interfering further in immigration, asylum, human rights, and all kinds of other matters which have nothing to do with the so-called single market? And 4, why did you give up the UK veto on further moves towards a fiscal and political union? 5, how can you stop us from being dragged in and from being made to pay for these arrangements? The answer is that the Remain campaign have absolutely no answer to any of these questions, because they are asking us to remain in an EU that is wholly unreformed and going in the wrong direction. If we leave on June the 23rd, if we vote to leave, we can still, of course, provide leadership in Europe in so many of the ways that Britain always has. We can help lead on discussions on security, counter-terrorism, foreign defence policy, all of which, of course, always used to be done under the old three-pillar framework in an intergovernmental way and between nation states, without the need for legal instruments enforced by the European Court of Justice. We will still be able to cooperate on the environment, on migration, on science, on technology. We'll still have exchanges of students. We will trade as much as before, if not more than ever before. And we will be able to love our fellow Europeans, marry them, live with them, share the joy of discovering different cultures and languages. But we will not be subject to the jurisdiction of a single court and legal system that is proving increasingly erratic and that is imitated by no other trading group around the world. We will not lose influence in Europe or in the world. On the contrary, you could argue actually that we'll gain in clout because we are being drowned out around the table in Brussels, not just by QMV, but of course we have a Eurozone caucus that can outvote the UK on any point at all. We've been outvoted now more than any other country, 72 times in the last 20 years and ever more regularly since 2010. We can actually recapture or secure our voice on the world stage, the fifth biggest economy in the world as we are, in international bodies such as the WTO and the IMF, or CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, where the EU is increasingly replacing us or laying a claim to speak on our behalf. And again, if you want final and conclusive proof of our inability to, quote-unquote, get our way in Brussels, and the contempt with which we will be treated if we vote to remain, look again at that EU deal and the total failure to secure any change, that UK deal and the total failure to secure any change of any significance. And finally, and above all, to get to the third key point of the Remainers with which I began, if we vote to leave the EU, we will not be voting to leave Europe. Of all the arguments that they make, this is the one that infuriates me the most in a hotly contested field. I am a child of Europe. I am, as I say, a liberal cosmopolitan. My family is a genetically equivalent of a UN peacekeeping force. I can read novels in French. I think I've even read a novel in Spanish. I can sing the Ode to Joy in German. I will. Well, if you keep accusing me of being a little ignorant, I will. Freude, schöne Goethe, Funken. Anyway, you know it. You know it. Both as editor of The Spectator and as Mayor of London, I have promoted actively the teaching of modern languages I won't go on. I won't go on with I've promoted the teaching of modern European languages in our schools, French and German, which are dying out, by the way, at the moment, dying out under this government of Remainers. And I've dedicated much of my life to the study of the common origins of our European civilization in ancient Greece and Rome. And so I find it offensive, insulting, irrelevant, and positively cretinous to be told, sometimes by people who can barely speak a foreign language, that I belong to a group of small-minded xenophobes. Because the truth is that it is Brexit that is now the great project of European liberalism. And it is leaving the EU. It is we who want to leave the EU who are the ideas. I'm afraid it is the European
Boris
Union.
Johnson on why he wants the UK to vote to leave the EU in the referendum on the 23rd of June. Viewers on BBC Two are leaving us, but this speech continues on BBC News.
And it is they who are defending an obscurantist and universalist system of government that is now well past its sell-by date and which is ever more remote from ordinary voters. It is we in the Leave camp, we who vote Leave, not they, who stand in the tradition of the liberal cosmopolitan European Enlightenment, not just of Locke and Wilkes, but of Rousseau and Voltaire. And though they are many, and though they are well-funded, and though we know that they can call on unlimited taxpayer funds for their leaflets, it is we happy few leavers, who have the inestimable advantage of believing strongly in our cause and that we will be vindicated by history. And we will win for exactly the same reason that the Greeks beat the Persians at Marathon, because they are fighting for an outdated absolutist ideology and we are fighting for freedom. That is the choice on June the 23rd. It is between taking back control of our money or giving a further £100 billion to Brussels before the next election, between deciding who we want to come here to live and work, or letting the EU decide. It is a choice between a dynamic, liberal, cosmopolitan, open, global, free-trading, prosperous Britain, or a Britain where we remain subject to an undemocratic system devised in the 1950s that is now actively responsible for low growth and in some cases causing economic despair. It is a choice between believing in the possibility of hope and change in Europe or accepting that we have no choice but to knuckle under. It is a choice between getting dragged ever further into a federal superstate or taking a stand now. And that is why I urge you to vote Leave on June the 23rd and take back control of our democracy. Thank you very much.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.